Good morning, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back. Welcome to the Islamophobia files, where we explore how anti-Muslim racism shapes societies at the level of law, policy, culture, and everyday life. I'm Dr. Hatem Bazian, and today I'm joined by Amani Hassani, an urban ethnographer and Liverhome Early Career Fellow at Burnell University. Amani's work sits at the intersection of sociology, anthropology, and human geography, with a focus on how processes of racialization and Islamophobia manifest in urban space. Her current project, The Other's Right to the City, it examines Denmark's controversial ghetto policy, the fact that we're still talking about ghetto policy, and how state-led urban renewal intersects with questions of race, class, and belonging. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, Navigating Colorblind Societies, a comparative ethnography of Muslim urban life in Copenhagen and Montreal, which deepens our understanding of how Muslims navigate racialization in different contexts across the global north. We'll be discussing her research on space, belonging, and the politics of Islamophobia in Europe and beyond. Welcome, Amani, and it's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Assalamu alaikum. Nice to be here, and thank you so much for having me on here.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So let's get into a framing question on your research. To start, could you tell us what drew your studying the intersection of urban life, racialization, and Islamophobia? So what was the spark? How did you get into this space? Because it's not the everyday choices that people make. So what was your choice?
It was I kind of walked backwards into this. So it started with my PhD project. Actually, it started earlier with my master's back in the 2010s. And I started off looking at migrant youth and second generation migrant youth and so on. And I realized that although like ethnicity and migration studies is very focused on the idea of ethnicity and cultures and so on, what young people spoke about wasn't necessarily that. They spoke about what matters to them in their lives. And so oftentimes it's about being in the space they're in. It's being at university. It's being in this, living in the city they're in. And so that kind of formulated my doctoral research, which is Muslim urban life. So in the book, Navigating Colorblind Societies, I kind of move away from the question of ethnicity. I look at Muslims beyond the ethnic or the racialization of, the ethnic other, as they call them in Denmark. Instead I looked at how they self-identified as Muslims, how policies and politicians and rhetoric identified them as Muslims, the way those two identifications clash sometimes, and then when does it not matter? When does the political rhetoric of being a Muslim youth being Muslim not matter to these young people? And so I kind of, when I talked to these young people, I spoke to them, oh, what do you think about, at the time in Montreal, there was this whole talk about the hijab ban, banning the hijab in Quebec, and young Muslim women especially felt very targeted by these political rhetoric. And so we spoke a lot about that, and a lot of the book is about that point in their lives. But then I stopped asking questions about the experiences of Islamophobia and just asked, okay, so show me your city. And this is when they just showed me around. They showed me their childhood neighborhood. They showed me their local mosque where they learned to read Quran. And they showed me how they embedded themselves in the physical manifestation of space. And so it kind of, they may not have been on the forefronts of demonstrations against political Islamophobia and so on, but just living, embedding themselves in the stories of the city made them rooted. Politicians could talk from today till tomorrow about how they don't belong, but these young people belonged. They belonged in the Copenhagen spaces where I did my ethnography. They belonged in Montreal. Both contexts both Denmark and Quebec, on the other hand, they both struggle with including Muslims as part of their national imagination of who Quebec is or who Denmark is. But that didn't matter on the urban level, on the city level, on the everyday level. And so that took me on to at the end of my PhD research, Denmark decided to bring out this ghetto policy, which tried to manifest or tried to yank this attachment to the space Muslim communities have made in their new homes. And so I then ended up doing ethnography. I went back to Denmark, did an ethnographic study on who has the right to the city. Is it the people who create the neighborhood, the people who create the feelings of community, or is it politicians who have other loyalties, amongst other things, to capitalism, neoliberalization of homes, but also the idea of the nation state, of upholding a certain image of what the nation state is. And Muslims often, not necessarily consciously, but politicians have made Muslims the villain of who Denmark is and who Denmark is supposed to be. Kind of long.
No, that's a great answer, because at times as a graduate students or as early career, we have questions and we come into the research with one question. By the time we end up, we're like almost in a completely different space and different location, which is great. Which gets me to my next question. You describe yourself as working at the crossroads of sociology, anthropology, and human geography. And so how do these different disciplines that you are working in see Islamophobia differently than if you're approaching it from a single discipline? As you know, in the university, we have these walls, like, if you're in the second floor of sociology, you are not allowed to go across to the third or fourth floor where anthropology or political science. So how each of these disciplines, and then how do you see yourself in this crossroads in researching Islamophobia?
That's a really good question. And I think early on, I felt very uncomfortable with the box of, I started off doing my master's in anthropology, and I did it in Denmark. And anthropology in Denmark has a very unique way of describing itself. And then I came to...
And just not to interrupt, but anthropology as a field developed concurrently with colonization. So there's a long history.
That's exactly it. And I felt that. I think that's the idea of anthropology, where I feel a sort of like, it's not just a discomfort, it's also a challenge of the conversations that are being had, not just in the past, but also contemporarily. The idea of anthropology of being the study of the other. And here I am feeling as the other. And this idea of going back, these are my communities. My interlocutors are my interlocutors and not my informants, as traditional anthropology will have it. And so, but I still use anthropological concepts. I'm very inspired by anthropological thinkers who push back towards this history of where anthropology was, and where anthropology is trying to shift itself in the conversations, but still its direction of conversation is towards the global South. You're having a conversation about the global South in the global North. And that doesn't sit right with me, because I'm really interested, actually, much more than I study Muslims, but and Islamophobia, but my focus is the way the colonial structures, its history and its present manifestation, it has made Muslims the threat of the global North. I think I'm really interested in pushing back, of saying that, no, I'm actually interested in looking at white supremacy and how that is manifested in ethno-nationalism. So even though I speak with Muslim communities, I speak about and analyze critically the nation state and the political rhetoric. And so this is where I then move into sociology and the politics of matters, of coming back to the global north, of saying, hey, okay, let's not focus on the others, but let's focus on the power dynamics that we are enforcing here, and how that kind of creates certain policies that really oppress certain populations within the global north. And then I kind of, like, geography came very late here, very recently, because my entire focus is very spatially oriented, because I'm not just interested in how people deal with each other. I'm interested in how the physical manifestation of space forces certain ways of being together, but also how there's a political interest in the spaces we live in limiting certain socialities and promoting other social ways of being, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I'm assuming, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that there was whole push towards so-called objectivity and being distant from your subject in, especially anthropology, sociology, and so on. So how was that experience for you as a researcher that attempts to really challenge the boundaries of the fields as they have been constructed by individuals that said they're engaged objectively, but far from it, because they took themselves to be the universal normal or norm. And as such, how did you navigate that?
I think I'm still navigating it. I'm in the midst of it, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm in especially urban studies is still a very white field, and entering that space, it's a white male field, and entering that space, about racialization of Muslims, of speaking about a policy. So remember the ghetto policy in Denmark, the report and the policy itself doesn't mention Muslims even once. So when I say, no, this entire policy is not just, we can't just have a new Marxist analysis of housing in Denmark, criticizing the neoliberalization of the welfare state. No, the essence of this policy is the racialization of Muslims and trying to remove them from their community, disbanding their communities, as it's been expressed in public housing in Denmark. And that is a serious push. And I think the first thing that many people will say is that, how can you be objective in this? I'm not just a Muslim woman. I'm a Muslim woman who grew up in these communities that are being vilified, right? So I'm very much consciously positioning myself within the community that I'm actually working with. And I consciously say I'm working with these communities because they're the ones who are feeding my analysis. And I think that is a very different perspective, because I'm not interested in feeding policymakers. I'm interested in representing and archiving the experiences of communities that are currently being not just vilified and marginalized, they're also being they're being banished. They're literally being uprooted from their neighborhoods. So I think there's a very important approach in my research, and I'm becoming more and more confident in saying that, no, I am not objective, and I refuse to be objective, and my subjectivity is based within the community that I work with. Yeah.
Good. You took us into the discussion about the ghetto policy, and I actually wanted to go into it in a more detailed way. So for your current project that looks at Denmark's ghetto policy specifically, and for our listeners who possibly have no idea about this policy, what does this policy entail in terms of the specifics, and why is it matters for understanding Islamophobia from a spatialized Islamophobia as it relates to space, geography, and so on. So what is this policy entails?
Yeah, so the policy, that's a really good question, and I'm going to try to keep it brief.
No, go ahead.
Well,
We have
okay,
time, so that's
okay. If you said go ahead, I'll go ahead.
yeah. We have time to unpack
Yeah.
this because again, we're delving into the specificity of the different articulations of Islamophobia.
Yeah. And I think this is, for me, the ghetto policy is a really interesting way of looking at Islamophobia and its manifestations, because the ghetto policy is, let me backtrack it a little bit and give the
Sure.
context of Denmark. Denmark is worldly known as a progressive welfare state. And it has a very universalistic approach to the welfare state. It means that the welfare services is for the many, the few. And so public housing, as opposed to many other cities or countries in the world, public housing in Denmark is very much a part of the ideal of the welfare state, and homes as being a right and not a commodity. And this is changing right now, right? But essentially what Denmark did in post-World War II was create all these homes that are affordable, that can house families, and that are open to all. Everyone could get an affordable rental home in Denmark. And so even today, about 20% of the population live in public housing in Denmark. Now, part of this history, post-World War II, this is when the first wave of migrant workers came from the global south, many from Muslim majority countries. And where else to live but to live in these, many of these labor migrants actually helped build these public housing structures and buildings, and they moved in there and they reunified with their families. And so from the early 70s, these families have created communities based on the welfare model of saying that homes are right, communities flourish in these areas. Is part of this utopian idea of what a good social democratic welfare state should be. Free education, schools are within the community, within the neighborhood. And so many families, who both working class white families, but a lot of migrant families, found their homes in these public housing communities. As the 80s came, the Lebanese war, many Palestinian refugees came to Denmark as well. And then a lot of them were housed in public housing as well, creating a really secure neighborhood for them to actually also flourish in generations to come. So many of my interlocutors come from Palestinian families who've been multiply displaced after the Nakba, and they found a home in these public housing areas. They created a network to support each other. Other refugee streams from Somalia, from Bosnia, and so on. Okay, so now I'm painting a picture of public housing as being for the many, but especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable in our communities. And they live side by side, right? And this, for many years, there hasn't been, well, they've created communities, they've created neighborhoods. But as the 90s came along, and a new idea of trying to protect the white Danish state from migration, harsher border control arose, and a new discourse that vilified public housing, especially in the major cities that housed many Muslim communities. These communities became vilified as the politicians called it ghettoization processes. And we need to limit the ghettoization. So throughout the early 2000s, there was an increase in policies trying to solve the ghetto problem, but these were never necessarily explicitly racial until the 2018 legislation. And here, for the first time, the government actually introduced the first and most essential criteria to handle these ghettos is if there's more than 50% non-Westerners. And now, for people outside of Denmark, what is non-Westerners? This like colorblind idea of we don't know who are non-Westerners. This is really important to mention. These are global South countries, all of them. They exclude Australia, the US, North America. They exclude Israel, and they exclude other majority Christian countries, just nitpicking as the politicians see fit.
Did they actually list a number of countries in the policy of what is demarcation of Western and non-Western?
Yeah, so no, they don't necessarily have to do that because they have the National Statistics Bank that provides the definition, and the definition is very closely aligned with what politicians are asking them to do. So politicians will then have non-Westerners, and then they say, oh, but we actually don't have an issue with Thailand migrants. We have an issue with Muslim majority migrants, or migrants from Muslim majority countries. And so they specify a new concept within the non-Westerners, which is Middle Eastern, North African, Pakistan, and Turkey. Just to make it more specific, but in the main legislation of 2018, it's just the major concept of non-Westerners. And this is both migrants, but also descendants. And that's a really important point to say, that nationalization, so legal national citizenship, does not necessarily protect you from this.
So basically, what you're saying is that the definition of citizenship and belonging goes through a very specific DNA bloodline marker, rather than the legal definition of what citizenship and belonging, which possibly also we could maybe expand it to the whole discussion in Europe about who belongs and who doesn't, includes generations.
And I think that's the really important point here with the ghetto legislation, because this is the first time that the Danish government goes very specifically and targets non-Westerners as a catch-all phrase for everyone who's racialized as non-white. That's essentially what it comes down to. If you're racialized as non-white from the global majority, if you will, from the global South, there are barriers to your access to public housing. This is a very big change in universalistic principles of the welfare state. Now, the welfare state now moves from being open to all living in Denmark to being open to only a specific number. And if you do not belong to a certain racial category, but never use racial, like you don't speak about racial categories in Denmark, which is why my approach to the policy is a bit controversial, is because I insist on the focus on ethnicity and non-Westerners as these are racial constructs. And the racial construct is not necessarily just on the color of your skin, but very much cultural. And that is when we have to dig deeper into the policies themselves, because the policies themselves will not say, oh, the color of skin means that this area will be targeted with these policies. No, it looks at the cultural expressions. And this is where the Islamophobia comes in. So one of the main issues is saying that children living in these like non-Western majority neighborhoods cannot go to schools and nurseries within the same communities if there's more than 30% from the same neighborhood, because the idea is if you're going to school and nursery with other non-Westerners, you will not integrate, assimilate into white Danish culture. So basically the idea of what Danishness is essentialized to whiteness, white values, because Westerners meaning North Americans and Australians and other Europeans, are not part of the same, they're not under the same scrutiny. They're not under the same surveillance because they're assumed to be closer to Danish values, right? And so you have all these color lines that all of a sudden become obscure but omnipresent. And I think for a lot of people in Denmark, as well as outside of Denmark, they don't know how to navigate it unless you're actually paying attention to what's being said. And what's being said is that we need to get rid of parallel societies where there's no gender equality, where there's no respect for democracy, where children and women do not have a freedom to socialize, right? And all of these, you can hear it, right? You can hear the Orientalism in these. Politicians will say it, but they will not write it in policy because you end up, it's illegal. It's unconstitutional because you have a right to religious freedom. You have a right to your cultural expressions, right? Yeah.
So my interest in terms of how the state language and politician language on ghettos and who belongs to the ghettos and who needs to be transformed gets to reinforce the ideas about Muslims and immigrants as a threat to national security.
Yeah.
And how does this policy, in essence, mirror or almost replicate war on terror framework, but using this spatial type of intervention in the community?
Yeah, that's exactly, you hit the nail on the head there, because it's exactly what's being reproduced in the language of the policy. What's being highlighted is the fact that white Danes might become a minority within neighborhoods of Denmark, and that should never be the case. That's actually explicitly a phrase said in Parliament and agreed upon, that white what they call in Denmark ethnic Danes should never be a minority within a neighborhood. And then the ghetto policy then starts to create these policies to try to limit how the amount of non-Westerners who live in a community, right, in a neighborhood, with the idea of the Great Replacement theory, right? This far right discourse saying that white Danes are being replaced by ethnic others, to use the rhetoric that's being used, right? And Muslims in Denmark are the ethnic other, right? In other contexts, there might be other people, but non-Westerners are racialized to being Muslim. Whether they're Muslim or not doesn't really matter. Whether they're practicing or not doesn't really matter. The idea politically is that if you have a Muslim background or seen as non-Westerner or from a Muslim majority country, you're part of the demographic that threatens the social cohesion of Denmark.
Now, if I could possibly also get this ghetto policy from a larger lens, the same dynamic is taking place in the United States and other places. Gentrification is occurring, so-called urban renewal, where the problem is the residents, not the economic, political, transnational trickle-down economic. So do you see those in terms of the comparisons that are taking place from a larger lens?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why it's so easy to see the Danish policies from a gentrification lens or a critical gentrification lens of saying, oh, you're pushing the poor people out of the cities, because essentially that's what's being done, and to bring in the middle classes, right? I think from a larger lens, that's exactly the dynamics that are happening. I think in the Danish context, given its history and connection to the the idealistic idea of what the welfare state should have been or should be, it would not have been possible to enforce a gentrification based on pushing poor people out of the city. Much easier to feed to the population that these people don't belong anyways in our cities, and we need to retake our cities because they've been they've been taken over by some other, right? And I think that's a really important rhetoric that's unique to Denmark, but you're seeing European countries they've been flooding to Denmark. The government has actually managed to create this policy because, hey, that would solve a lot of our problems, right? What Denmark has done is taken integration and how homes, taken homes from being a right and integration to being a surveillance mechanism and put them together. And now all of a sudden they can use public housing to surveil racialized others, Muslim communities, to see how they express their cultures, how they do all these things through all of the public services there, right? So the ghetto policy, although it's about homes being dismantled and destroyed, similar to other places. Like if you look at the policies, it's very similar to what's going on in a lot of U.S. American cities, what's going on in UK as well. But when you're looking at why, the explanation of why we must do it, the racial component is explicit in Denmark. And that is something you couldn't get away with so easily in the US or the UK or other places. In fact, Denmark is currently being prosecuted by its residents who say that the law is discriminatory at EU level. So that's something we're waiting for hearing back about. But I think that's what's unique about Denmark. Denmark managed to put race into the equation of gentrification.
Great. So I want to move from your work on the ghetto policy into your comparative ethnography and colorblind racism. Your forthcoming book, Navigating Colorblind Societies, compares Muslim urban life in Copenhagen and Montreal. So first, why Copenhagen and Montreal as the two focal point? And I know that we had a comparison between the Bay Area and Sydney, Australia, so there are ways to compare. So why the comparisons in there? And what do these two contexts reveal about how colorblind racism and Islamophobia operate in different national settings? Because Denmark, there's color blindness, France, color blindness, Quebec, color blindness. So what is there in terms of the comparison?
I think there's
and maybe to speak a little bit about the methodology of ethnography as a point of departure for research for our listeners who might be interested in doing similar projects.
Okay, so I'll try to expand on the different levels of why these two concepts are interesting. First of all, I have a very personal connection with both. I was living in Montreal and I'm from Denmark, not originally, but born and raised there. And so I know Copenhagen and I know Montreal. And as I was living in Montreal, I kept comparing. I kept going back to compare to what's happening in Denmark. I was living in Quebec at a time where the ethno-nationalism of Quebec was becoming more and more pronounced. And I'm like, this isn't, a lot of people are making the connection between Quebec and France. And for me, it struck me that Quebec is much closer to what I know of in Denmark, but there's very little transnational conversations or transatlantic conversations on Muslim experiences. And so I wanted to look at the differences between these two contexts, but I also wanted to look at the similarities. Quebec is within the region of, is a francophone region within Anglophone North America. And so it's feeling the pressure of Anglophone Canada. Even when I was talking to my interlocutors, they often said, you know what, if it gets really bad here, we'll just go to Toronto, we'll go to Ontario, we have an out. We have an out. And I think that's a real, that's a threat to the ethno-nationalist francophone Quebecers, because they need people and they need francophone people. And interestingly, my interlocutors were not just bilingual, they were trilingual. They spoke often Arabic or Pakistan or Urdu, and they had French and English as fluent languages, right? They had a real capacity to just move, right? And yet they stayed put until, until they were of a socioeconomic position that was so comfortable that we can stay put until it gets too much. And then the rest of Canada was open to them. In comparison, my interlocutors in Denmark is the same thing, right? Denmark is a small country within a globalizing Europe, right? Feeling the pressure of, Danish being a very, very small language, and feeling the pressure of Denmark needing migrants, but not wanting migrants. And I think there's a lot to compare here with the ethno-nationalism of these two countries, and both they have colonial histories, but no one is unpacking these colonial histories. And I think their colonial histories is shining through their current processes of ethno-nationalism and Islamophobia. And I think that became more and more apparent as I was doing ethnographic research. So this power of ethnographic research, and why I still call myself an anthropologist, because ethnographic research is not just qualitative interviews of sitting down and chatting with people. It's a multifaceted methodology. It's me wandering around the city, not knowing where I'm going, but also noticing things that other people might not notice. It's asking my interlocutors to walk with me through different spaces. And then going back and looking at the archives and looking at what is historic about Quebec's uncomfort with migrants and Muslims in specific. And it brought me back to the 1990s where the prime minister of Quebec at the time said that we lost, they had a vote about separating from Anglophone Canada, and they lost that vote, and he said it's because of money and the ethnic vote. And so that's the rise of the volatile atmosphere towards ethnic minorities, similar in Denmark throughout the 90s. And then came the war on terror, right? And the war on terror came at the perfect time, at the very perfect time where these nationalist sentiments were rising. And so this perfect villain of the Muslim other was ripe for picking, right? And I think these two, no one would think of comparing these two contexts, but I think once you look at them side by side and look at the potentials they give young Muslims, and look at how, so there's a certain level of gaslighting in terms of Islamophobia is not a real thing. So spoke to young people both in Montreal but also in Copenhagen. No one talked about racism. No one talked this was in 2013-14, right? No one spoke about Islamophobia. I think now 10 years on, we're much more the conversation in public has become much more expansive and open in terms of trying to tease out the way Islamophobia is being expressed. But back then, when I stopped asking them about racism and these things, they showed it in different ways, right? They showed how they don't talk to Danes about being Danish because, hey, they're just going to say, I'm not Danish. And I don't care. I live my life. I'll eat my Danish rye bread and watch movies and speak Danish whenever I want. It's none of their business, right? And then in Montreal, they're like, I'm going to wear my hijab. I have a problem with it. I'll just pick up and go to the border of Quebec and work in Ontario, And there's possibilities of navigating a space that says, oh, we don't see color, and yet color is seeped through. You may say you don't see color, but color, it shadows the entire terrain, both in terms of spaces. Like you'll have literal political campaigns calling Islam for Nazi Islam, or in Denmark, this is a conservative party slogan in 2015. In Quebec, you have the Quebec government's equating like hijabs with inequality of genders and so on, right? And it's on posters in spaces that these Muslims have to navigate. And the most hopeful part of this is looking at agency as a capacity for action, right? And this is Sabah Mahmoud's concept of, I'll navigate through the injustices of the political and racist terrain. I'll navigate through it and find my way to make the most meaningful life for myself, right? And I think that's, the book really ended up both being a critical examination of how these countries who refuse to talk about race, how Islamophobia is seeped through the rhetoric, and then this it's juxtaposed with these narratives from young Muslims, and the cool thing is it's you can compare the conversations or I've had with Muslims in Montreal with Muslims in Copenhagen, and they're physically, materially, they're a world apart, but the way that they speak about their lives in the city is embedded in the history of the city. It's embedded in the history of their migration stories, and it's they've literally written themselves into the city histories, both in Montreal and in Copenhagen, no matter what political ideas of what the nation state is, right?
Great. So when I move to urban space, nationalism, and belonging, one way we could at least understand racism is governing the body, space, and time of targeted minorities. So just to crystallize this notion. So much of your research connects nationalism with the control of urban space. Why do you think cities in particular become sites of contestation around Muslim presence and identity? And how they roll into this national debate, especially with this whole replacement theory that is, active in the background?
I think that's why I like looking at cities. I think the book shows that cities have so much potential in creating communities, in creating spaces for yourself in spite of marginalization, in spite of the surveillance of the state and the violence of the state. Cities have a potential. They have pockets of free space. I wouldn't say safe space, but you can use the spaces of cities in ways that really irk
And maybe just to jump, in one of the surveys, we identified, or at least asked the question of where people feel safe as Muslims, but also to compare it where Black communities feel safe and why crossing the railroad track from one section of the city to the other resulted in often violent consequences for targeted minorities.
And I think that's what cities also. So this is really important. That's a really interesting part of urban politics in the ghetto legislation. So a lot of policies in Denmark is about safety, of urban safety. But urban safety is never about racialized minorities feeling safe across the railway tracks. It's about white folks feeling safe in, ethnically majority neighborhoods. And the truth of it is, it doesn't really connect with the reality of safety. But it's very interesting to see that there's no conversations about the safety of Muslims in public space. There's a increase of hate crimes against the Muslims, especially visibly noticeable. Muslims, women wearing hijab, there's an increased violence and hate speech against them, but there's no conversation of the safety of the racialized Muslim. There's literally, it doesn't exist in the political rhetoric. Safety measures is connected to white safety, and therefore it feeds into urban policies of creating and dismantling non-Western neighborhoods because they create unsafe environments. And unsafe, the underlying implication here is unsafe for middle class majority Danes. And I think that's a really important, it's an important part of the governmental rhetoric of trying to target these communities. And then the other side of it, you have young people, young Muslims, and I think that comes out in the book. They show how how they'll navigate through racialized spaces, so spaces unsafe by the government. The academic term is stigmatized, or territorial stigmatization, right? And how they'll navigate through that, feeling very comfortable. This is their space. This is where they grew up. They feel no sense of unsafety there. And then you have the same conversation, especially with young Muslims in the Danish context who've experienced an increased social mobility. So they come from, immigrant, working class backgrounds in these stigmatized areas, and then they become university educated and professionals. And now they have to actually venture into corporate life, right? And these very white spaces. And all of a sudden feeling themselves hyper visible, having to walk in a space that they feel so uncomfortable and unsafe in, but not unsafe in the physical sense, because this is a professional work environment, but potentially also the microaggressions that come with being so hyper visible in these middle class white spaces, professional spaces, right? And I think there's a way of this is a part of what the focus of the book is looking at how do you navigate these spaces? How do you go from being just one of the masses of your neighborhood, giving salams to your, old auntie that you pass by, and then going to outside of that and going into what is upper class, affluent, or white spaces, right? And I think it was amazing to see a lot of young Muslims who were born and raised in their context being very comfortable navigating in both spaces, right? They'll go to this and that. I think the ones who are feeling a discomfort is really because they're very the governmental rhetoric of forcing them to feel an unbelonging is becoming more and more pronounced, where it's as if you cannot step out of this comfortable racialized space because you don't really belong here. You're not part of the social cohesion of Denmark, right? That said, I do still see space, like the city space, and the reason why the government is really highlighting public housing as neighborhoods as the target is because it has historically in the past 40 years created the best avenues in spite of its socioeconomic marginalization. It's created a really powerful informal social care structures for people who are so vilified by general Danish society, and or maybe not Danish society, but the political spectrum of Denmark. So I think there's a battle going on right now between how people live, how people use and navigate the cities, because cities are a step down from government, right? So governments can create all these laws that surveil Muslims and their cultural experiences and so on, but there's potential in the everyday life that is material, right? You move around in the city, right? And I think there's a potential in that is currently, if you think of, you navigate through a terrain until there's a roadblock. And I feel like the government is just trying to create all these roadblocks now to create an atmosphere where racialized communities, Muslim communities in Denmark are just, they're becoming more and more trapped and disconnected from each other. And I think that's really important. It's the connection of the community that is being vilified here.
Well, during a certain period, let's say from post-World War II until maybe the early 80s, this notion of we're having a war on poverty. And from the 80s until today, we have a war on the poor.
Yeah.
So the poor becomes the problem. And within that construct is the racial other. And what's really is profound about your work in terms of the ethnography and the urban space is looking at how Islamophobia intersects with poverty, but also in terms of schooling, housing, policing, and the space. So how, let's see, within the context of the Danish, is there a conversation about this withdrawal of the social welfare state for everyone, while using the Muslim threat as the, what I call it, the Muslim ink or the fear ink, making the threat or the fear to really conceal this withdrawal of the welfare state for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to do with this project, right? I look at housing as an entryway to discuss all of this, right? And I think there's something very unique about Denmark and the Danish population in the sense that there's a there's still faith in politicians, and I think that's something that's very it's interesting to navigate when you or look at, because you have the neoliberalization of healthcare in Denmark. There's a neoliberalization going on educational services, on most public services. There's a way politicians are kind of neoliberalizing and privatizing through the back door. I usually use. And the ghetto policy is the one policy that's it's genius, actually, if you want to look at it, because public housing, the way it's structured in Denmark is that you have educational services, you have nurseries, you have doctors, GPs, you have everything within the same neighborhood, right? And then if you create a policy that targets a neighborhood or public housing as a whole, you have access to control and surveil a lot of different public services and figure out how to kind of neoliberalize, how to dismantle. So part of the ghetto policy is also to sell out public housing to private, right? Private corporations, not individuals. Private corporations, and that way you're kind of forcing people away from the public housing sector, but then the ones who remain, you can see how do they live their lives in terms of family values? How do they live? How do they socialize? Because all of these health services that are part of the welfare state is within the neighborhood. And I think that's really interesting to see in Denmark, is that Denmark is not escaping neoliberalization, but the political class has convinced the masses that it's doing it for the nation state's well-being. The buzzword here is social cohesion. And social cohesion is only attained by whiteness, white Western values, or an assimilation in proximity to white Western values. And it's a powerful political rhetoric, because you've seen across the political spectrum, from the right to the left, people buying into this this rhetoric. So there's a way of saying that we have the welfare state, but for us, not for them. And now them includes anyone who doesn't fit the bracket that fits into the social cohesion of Denmark, as Denmark for Danes, as white Danes. Yeah, and I think that's a really, we'll see where it goes, but right now there's very little conversation on how the welfare state is being dismantled.
Now, you mentioned in terms of the diversity of the Muslim community, but diversity of the various immigrant communities. Has there been conversations across the different communities that are facing the same challenge? Let's say Black African migrants, refugees, Syrians, Palestinians. Has there been that type of conversation?
The interesting thing, and that might be a blessing in disguise, the concept of non-Westerners has bracketed, I was going to say, all of us in the same thing, right? So there's, like, in everyday life and socialization, there are differences, right? But the way that these neighborhoods are is, one interlocutor, Syrian interlocutor, was telling me her mom they came as a refugee family, lived there for almost 30 years now. And her mom came not knowing anyone. And now she's throughout her, like my interlocutor's childhood as well, her siblings, she was the one in the playground getting to know other refugee moms. And they may not speak the same language. You have Bosnians and Somalis, but you're helping each other. She called it how to survive in a new country hack, right? So how do you hack yourself into a new country? But I think there's something unique about Denmark because of the welfare services, the bureaucracy of accessing welfare is so convoluted. And so these informal networks were really a way for people across ethnic, linguistic, cultural backgrounds to just support each other. The ones who spoke Danish will read municipality letters to the others who may not, and you have people translating for each other. And there's a really, throughout the years before the government decided to dismantle these communities, there's been a really strong community of care. And I think what is unique about the Danish ghetto is the fact that it's so diverse. It's so diverse. Many are Muslims, but many are from very different parts of the world, right? So you grow Turks and Kurds living side by side, and you grow up with, Bosnians and Somalis and Palestinians, and everyone kind of get to know each other. Or if they don't, they at least live within the same neighborhood community, and their children grow up together. And I think that's the blessing of the colorblind rubric of racism, because it kind of put everyone together. And so, like, I speak about it. I speak about her in my book, a Palestinian youth, and I think there's a part of it is also the Palestinian solidarity that comes through everyone being together, right? And I think she was mentioning that it's not just her Palestinianness that is expressed in these neighborhoods, it's her other ethnic background, right? And it just, the fact that you're in this together, right? You're trying to navigate a very racist system without being allowed to call it racist, and then having to also create a community and uphold your solidarity with each other.
Yeah. We went into the resistance and possibilities, which was my next topic, which was really the fascinating aspect of how communities actually are developing resilience, and what stories that come out of your research, as well as your book, the Right to the City, which is also to play around in terms of the political right, attempting to claim both city and national consciousness. So what are some of these stories, experiences of resilience, of resistance, of really constructing one's own city and space that you have experienced? You began to mention, but maybe we could tease out some of those as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that I think resilience is a really powerful concept. I think resistance. So imagine, especially with the ghetto research, my previous research, I was dealing with people, young Muslims who were well ahead of getting social mobility, getting stable jobs and so on. But with this ghetto project, I'm actually dealing with the most marginalized of Danish society, the ones who are at the fringes and who are vilified at the fringes. And I think for me, resilience is the really go-to concept here. And I think there's one, I often use this example because I think it's so powerful. This is a story from a young Palestinian woman born and raised in Denmark, but she was telling me about her father. Her father came to Denmark in the 80s. In the 80s, Denmark had closed the borders for labor migrants. He came, he's Palestinian, but came through Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. He thought that Denmark would be a place for him to actually get stable employment and work and raise his family. So he came to Denmark, not knowing, thinking he could just get a job and become a labor migrant. The only reason why he was allowed into the country was because he was a refugee from the Lebanese Civil War. And so this young woman is telling me about her father, and he passed away 6 months before our conversation. So it was also a way for her to process this. this experience or her father's life in Denmark. And she was explaining how disappointed he was in life, because throughout the 80s economic recession, all the labor migrants were being laid off. They were all becoming unemployed, and the refugees were left with very little opportunities to get employment, right? And so he was sent from the one job center, which is the Danish bureaucracy of being unemployed, from one to another, trying to get him an employment. And for many years, he just couldn't get employed. And she's telling me this story, feeling sad on her father's behalf because he really tried. And the vilification of the refugee is that they came to take from the welfare state and not give back. And she's trying to attest to me, oh, but he really did try to give back, right? And she was telling me all of this, and she was explaining how the bureaucracy just broke her father completely. So at the end of it, he was diagnosed with depression, and he was given disability pension. And she was saying it with a little bit of hesitation, because there's a vilification of refugees who become disabled through either the system or because of war trauma. But so now this is where I find the hope and resilience of his story, because what happens when he becomes a pensioner? He gets a stable paycheck. And this avenue, by the way, is being shut down because Denmark is they're removing the rights of refugees to get pension and disability pension anyways. But this was the late 80s, early 90s, right? So he's becoming a pensioner. At the same time, there's different influxes of refugees. He helped establish the local mosque. He managed the madrasa, so the language school, the Quran school in his mosque. He ensured that his kids were dropped off and picked up. He was a family man. He was a community man, right? And as she was reflecting on this, she was just mentioning this as a by the way. And I was thinking, and as I reflect on her story, I found that this is the community of care that is established in the shadows, in the margins. That is what the stories that no one wants to hear about. And when they hear about it, they think ill of it. But he was uplifting not just his generation, creating an informal network for newly arrived refugees who needed a support system, but he was uplifting the second generations. He was making sure that they felt connected to both their religious and cultural communities. He was making sure that children spoke Arabic in the community and they learned Quran and they felt like mosque was a place to go, right? And isn't that a much bigger legacy than becoming an unskilled labor migrant that is disregarded by the government whenever he doesn't, if the economy doesn't fit him? And I found that story was such a strong and inspirational story of resistance, not resistance as in pushing back towards powers that are so above you, like in terms of government, but pushing back in terms of making sure that there's meaning within your community, that your community benefits from you, even though the capitalist structures doesn't see value. Your neighbors see value in you, your children see value in you, your family sees value in you, right? And so the modest disability allowance that he had, well, he lives in an affordable home. He lives in a community that provides free education for his children, all of whom are university educated. Benefiting from the welfare society, social mobility just skipped his generation, but in essence, the social mobility that his children and the second generation of his community had was really because of the vilification that he lived through and how it did not break him, how that it made him actually create communities, the mosque, the mosque is a community center, in spite of the vilification of the mosque in Danish political rhetoric, right? And I think that's really inspiring.
Great. As we begin to try to wrap up, I want for us to turn maybe to the bigger picture. And what lesson do you hope policymakers, academics, educators, or the wider public can take from your research? And what keeps you hopeful as you continue to work in really a painful setting?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I'm still working on trying to figure that out. I'm a part of me is feeling a bit. I struggle with policymakers
Yeah.
because I
That's a
find
universal phenomenon, by the
as a
way.
universal I'm not, yeah, I'm not, there's when I speak about politicians, and I speak, there's structures there, right? And policymakers create structures like urban planners, maybe not realizing, or maybe they do realize the fact that they're pushing a worldview onto a people, onto a community.
Yeah,
And
urban planning and zoning is such a very critical piece of how power limits, borders, constructs of belonging and not belonging.
yeah,
We have an area down here where 5 blocks of the city were sold to a developer, which meant pushing all of the poor out.
yeah,
And therefore, it transformed a whole area by saying we're building a new community, but the communities were brought in
yeah.
while those who were in already for a long time were pushed out.
Yeah.
So,
And they never managed to get the spirit of that community. And I think that's, for me, that's where my struggle is with the people who create the strategies, right? It's the strategies of the urban, of the policies and so on, because they oftentimes think of the bottom line, the capitalist gains of what a city should be. um, Policymakers in Denmark oftentimes are at they're given a task by the government, who is really holding on to power. And how do you hold on to power when you feel like you're being replaced, right? It's a very violent phenomenon, right?
mm,
I think a part of what I want to push is really the way practitioners think about the communities they're supposed to serve, and how the fact that the structures that they have to use, the policies that they have to use, are not necessarily for the benefit of the people they work they've worked to provide services for. I believe in the goodwill of social workers and of teachers, and oftentimes they're given policies to implement from the top down, and it creates, if you're not critical, it creates this blindness to see that, that Muhammad in your class as the villain of the
mm,
school, rather than actually see, oh, maybe there's something wider going on here, what's going on in this classroom, in this community, in this country, right? And I think policy is a way of forcing people to or forcing practitioners to actually not bear responsibilities, but we all bear responsibility of how we treat each other in the communities we live. I think I the really important part of what I'm trying to say with this is that the strong dominant narratives are not truth. They
mm.
don't they're invested in geopolitics, in capitalism, and in creating a world that's not necessarily for the better of the communities that live in specific environments and specific contexts.
Maybe just on the academic and the educational part, as someone who's teaching and writing on these uh, very critical issues that are problematized, that are driven for political capital and elections. What strategies do you find most effective and useful in helping students or audiences to grapple with Islamophobia in a so called colorblind society? So, what strategies do you use and you deploy?
So personally, I work a lot with uh, local community organizations. So I do in Denmark to feed my research into the community. I work with Center for Muslim Rights in Denmark, and I think that's for me a way of having my research, because I don't live in Denmark anymore. I haven't lived there for many years, but it connects me to the people I research amongst and feeds the research I have back into them. And I think as academics, we oftentimes think of the university setting as the place to create and think and produce knowledge, but I actually find that the conversations I have with the communities is the most important part that directs my research, and then feeding that research back into the community through these organizations, through providing and allowing my research to actually become not just academic concepts, but actually something that is useful for people who struggle for their rights, and people who are feeling the pressure, the political and policy pressure of legislations in different contexts. So I think that's a really important way of it's not even given back. It's essential to my own research to be embedded, not just my focus is on Muslim rights, but also on housing rights and working with organizations that work with housing rights, right? And working with people who are experiencing police violence or the surveillance of policies as they're fed into policing. And I think that for me is really important. It's an important teaching moment for myself, but it's also a way of making my research not applicable, like useful. It's not useful in the ivory tower. It's useful to students because I push them to reconsider the narratives and the concepts and the ideas of the Muslim villain, or and what that does, what that allows in terms of how governments in the global north have been able to infringe and repress freedom of thought, freedom of speech, not people who are fascist and racist, but people who are speaking against these powerful structures, right? Because they're the threat to power, right? And they speak truth to power. And I think it's important for us to feed our research back into the communities that we research.
Right. Now, I usually ask scholars individual maybe some reading recommendations, some your work. If you send us the links, we'll put it in the uh, description so people will have access to it. But some books, some materials you think is very critical for individuals to think of your work, but also broadly speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good question. I'll my Navigating Colorblind Societies is actually already out and recently out on paperback, so it's a little
I
bit.
did not get it yet, but I will
It's
get
a little.
my hand on it.
I'll send the link for that. But I think so this is where my anthropology and sociology and geography kind of speak together, because I like reading anthropological work on the global south or in the Middle East, and trying to think about the concepts that are being constructed there and how it's expressed in the global north. And I'm really inspired. So I love Sabah Mahmoud's Politics of Piety because
The late Sabah Mahmoud was
yeah,
our dear colleague here at
yes,
Berkeley.
yeah, oh yes, she's from yeah, she was at Berkeley. Yes, her work was amazing in terms of, so that's what I like about her approach, was that she actually critically re-examines feminist scholarship in the global north by looking at how Muslim women are part of the mosque movement in Egypt. And a lot of her conceptual work really speaks well into the Danish and Quebec context. So like a lot of criticism I get is like, how would you put Mahmoud's work in Egypt into a very progressive, Western society? And I think the idea of resistance when you're meeting political restrictions everywhere is so useful to think with. And then connecting that with more sociological work like Eduardo Bonilla Silva from the US, who speaks about colorblind racism, right? People rarely think of Denmark as a colorblind racist society, but it's very deeply so. And it's really interesting to look at Eduardo Bonilla Silva's concepts and frames in the Danish context, where you're not talking about racism. People are just saying, oh, it's just some cultures are better than other cultures, and just the liberal culture is a little bit better than non-liberal or like non-Western cultures, right? And I think that's a really useful way to think with. So and recently started looking into more work on what's happening in global north cities is also happening in Egypt, and it's happening in Lebanon and Middle Eastern societies. And there's some really interesting work. Now I forget I think it's Beirut Urban Center, but there's some really interesting work coming out of the Middle East, urban studies that really push the way we actually talk about urban life. And it's useful to really not just read from the global north context, that oftentimes really it focuses on certain elements, but you need sometimes to look at it from a different light and a different context to really be able to unpack how we can think about what's going on in our cities in a different way. And who's being pushed, who's being vilified, who's being erased from these spaces. And different places will have different ways. Like if you look at urban research done in Turkey and Istanbul, and it's really interesting to see how people are being pushed out and which people are being pushed out in different contexts, and comparing these.
Thank you.
No worries.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Islamophobia Files. A huge thanks to my guest, Amani Hassani. We'll make sure to drop the links to the books and the reading material, because it's very, very important to support and to also expand the field of Islamophobia studies by accessing sound research that has sustained engagement with communities. Amani shared her insights on how Islamophobia is not only about ideas and stereotypes, but also about the ways space, policy, and everyday life are structured to include some and exclude others. Amani's research reminds us that the questions of race and belonging are always lived on the ground, in neighborhoods, schools, housing projects, and city streets, and that Muslims across the global north are navigating, contesting, and reshaping these spaces every day. If you'd like to learn more about Amani's work, look out for her forthcoming book, Navigating Colorblind Societies, a comparative ethnography of Muslim urban life in Copenhagen and Montreal. And follow her ongoing research on Denmark's ghetto policy through her work at the university. Be sure to subscribe to the Islamophobia Files for more conversation with researchers, activists, and community voices who are working to expose and challenge anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia around the world. Until next time, I'm Dr. Hatem Bazian. Thanks for listening. Assalamu alaikum.